There was a day she noticed a discrepancy between sound and image on the television and found no matter how she messed with the tracking, she could not make it go away. Her husband couldn't see any problem. "It's fine," he kept saying, or at least it had been fine, he claimed, before she started screwing with it. He made her surrender the remote. The rest of the movie she spent watching the actor's lips move, the sound following only afterward at a remove. But her husband didn't see it, didn't notice it, only she did. I am Brian Evenson. I come from Providence, Rhode Island, where I teach at Brown University. I'm here in Iowa City for the Mission Creek Literary Festival. I often get asked the question of how I come up with my ideas. That seems to come up a lot for some reason, and I'm one of those writers who's lucky enough to have more ideas than I could ever possibly write about. So I have an embarrassment of riches in that regard. I think they ask it because my work is often kind of weird and eccentric, and they see things in it that they feel is that they would have a difficult time imagining, and so I think they're really just trying to figure out how messed up I am. I'm also one of those people who tend to be able to write almost anywhere. I've written, in hotel rooms. I've written once in the bathroom on a plane. Just almost anywhere will work for me. And the thing I found is that different places end up kind of influencing the writing in interesting ways. I don't like to write in a coffee shop because there's too much kind of going on around me in terms of movement and things. But other than that, almost anywhere. Even at home, I write in different places all the time. I think I have 3 kids, 2 of whom are in their 20s, and the youngest is 1 year old. And so when my first 2 kids were really young, I would always write from 12 to 2 in the morning. And it was because I knew I could have that time. It was the time when my wife was asleep and my kids were asleep, and I could kind of count on it. And then as time's gone on, I've just decided to make use of time whenever it comes. I think also as I get older, I'm less likely to be able to stay up and be coherent at 2 in the morning. So yeah, I mean, I really try to just make the most use of opportunities when they come along in terms of writing. Mm-hmm. The one thing I've always tried to do is if I have 15 minutes or a half hour to write, I really try to use it for that. It's so easy to kind of get distracted and, clearing your throat and warming up and looking on the internet for something, and before you know it, you're watching all sorts of things on YouTube. And so I really try to make the maximum use of whatever time I'm given. I began as a short story writer, and it's a form that I really love and admire. And I really think of myself, I write novels and have been successful with that, but really still think of myself as primarily a short story writer. And my favorite form is kind of the long short story or the novella, because I think it allows you a little bit more breadth and scope in terms of what you can do, and has a lot of the it has the concision and brevity of a short story in some regards, but also has more of the scope of a novel. So it has, for me, the best of both worlds. I think it does in some ways. I like teaching. I really enjoy teaching, and I use my creative writing classes as an excuse to read and reread books that I really want to read, and it gives me a chance to talk very specifically about the crafts of books that I admire. And then being around student writing all the time is interesting. I mean, partly because sometimes it's very interesting and very good, and other times it's not. And I think that I sometimes find myself responding to their work and thinking, oh, well, this potentially could have gone this other direction. And those sorts of things can end up being the germ for another idea later
Mm-hmm.
on. I love to read, and it doesn't sound like that's a good way to recharge your batteries for a writer, but I actually do find that that anytime I'm kind of stuck, or anytime the writing's not going well, or I'm exhausted, that reading is a great way to do it. And then the other thing I do is I walk a lot. I try to walk every day and try to get out, and just kind of being out and wandering is, I think, really a nice way of kind of letting your mind rest a little bit and opening you up to other things. There's certain things that I do go back to. I mean, it's the kind of thing that I don't necessarily notice it. I notice it more when people point it out to me. But there's certain sentence patterns that I gravitate towards. I like sentences that, that where they where it's a kind of list of things, and there should be an and connecting the last one, but I don't have an and so that I like that, which seems to me is something that's much more common in French than in English. But at a certain point, that can become a kind of affect. There's certain words, I think I've used the word sprint, which is a really strange word, like more than I should have. And there's other things like that I can, once I start looking, that I really, began to notice things that these tics that we as writers have. And a lot of those kind of get corrected over, through the editing process, I think. Well, I mean, I think a good editor is really able to take your work and make it better in its own terms. And I think a bad editor is really interested in hijacking the work. And so I would say that the best editors I've had really seem to have a high understanding of what I want to do with the work, and have some ideas about how to make it do it better. There are editors who really just want to change the work and can be very aggressive, and for the right person or the right work, that can be good. But I think that I've often had editors who want to make my work more normal or more conventional, and usually that editorial relationship doesn't work out so well. Partly because I think that the thing that I like about the work and what my readers like about my work is what makes it unique and eccentric. Usually the work is fairly done by the time it goes to an editor, so that the changes that are happening with the editorial process don't end up being like major structural changes. My first book was with Knopf, and so it was with a pretty big New York house, and that was great in the sense that it meant that the book was in all sorts of bookstores. It was just kind of automatically in that. It had a kind of built-in publicity that was just part of being with a big house. But then at the same time, I mean, my book, which would have been a big book for a small press, for Knopf was just a very small book. And so, you both got this kind of bump for the book, but also not really much attention in terms of publicity or editorial or anything like that. My publicity budget for my first book was $0. And so I found that experience very mixed. My editor was fired shortly after the book came out, and it was complicated. Coffee House is very faithful to my work. Since they're a non-profit, they I think my work does well for them, but they also they don't have to think about the bottom line quite as much as some larger houses do. My experience with Tor was very good. My editor left Tor during the middle of the book, which seems to happen a lot at large houses as opposed to smaller houses, and so there was a little bit of strangeness as a result of that. But I've liked all the different presses I've worked with in different ways. I feel like I've gotten something out of them. It looks like Coffee House just bought my my upcoming collection, and they're going to release a bunch of books that were originally published on other houses. So it's starting to feel like Coffee House is my main and even only publisher. I have a lot of ideas for things that I'd like to do and just haven't gotten to them. The book that came out with Tor, Immobility, I have an idea for a sequel I'd like to do, which would be called The Moans, and I just don't know when I'll get to that, if ever. I have an idea for a long novel, and I think it's taken me a while to figure out how to do a kind of big, long, epic novel. And so that too is something that's kind of coming up. And other than that, I mean, just various stories I'm working on, things like that. I do think that there is a spiritual aspect to writing, and for me, I think it's very specific in that I was forced at a particular moment to choose between my writing and my religion. And so in a sense, it's kind of stood in the place of spiritual practice for me. I do think that there's something meditative about writing. I do think that there's something about writing where you're trying to understand human nature and the way that it works. And my sense of that is that you're trying to do it both for the good aspects and the bad aspects of it. And I do think there's an intense empathy in really good writing. And so all those things, I think, for me, are tied to a kind of notion of what's spiritual. It's not exactly religious. I think it's a good distinction to make between those two things, but I do think that for me personally, it has been a kind of practice, and you know, I don't have a religion at this point. I'm excommunicated as a Mormon, and really feel like writing gives me a lot of, it feeds me in ways that religion used to. I mean, I think very early on, you know, having the Mormon Church kind of object to what I was doing made me think about, you know, why I was doing it, should I be doing it, did it matter, and you know, the act of being challenged over your work, or even to be told that it, you know, it was wrong or evil, is something that makes you kind of intensely committed to it. It also made me realize that it mattered to people what I did, and I think a lot of writers go through their career and just never have that kind of sense. They don't know what people, you know, their work is just falling kind of on deaf ears. But knowing that it mattered to people, even if it meant that they hated it, was actually great for me as a writer. It made me feel like what I was doing was serious, and that I had to make a decision about whether I was committed to it or not. I think that you know, as time's gone on, there's been more and more of a wall put up between genre and literary fiction. I don't think that wall was there early in American literature. I mean, I think, you know, Poe is an obvious example of someone who was doing what was considered, you know, literary fiction, and also had strong generic elements to it. I personally think that there's you know, there shouldn't be a wall between those two things, that literature and genre have a lot that they can learn from one another. But for years, I mean, I think I was very resistant to that idea. And then in 2003, I had a book called The Wavering Knife, which was a finalist for the International Horror Guild Prize. And I was shocked by that. I was surprised by that. I thought, you know, I'm not writing horror. I don't know why they would nominate me for this. And then it won that prize, and then I suddenly started looking at you know, some of the other work that was up for that, and started paying attention to what was going on, and realized that there was a lot of really interesting work being written on that side of the line that was called genre, and that if it had been you know, published as literature, people would see different aspects of it. And then Peter Straub took over Conjunctions magazine for an issue, and did an issue called The New Wave Fabulists, and that was Peter taking people who were considered to be genre writers and publishing them in a high literary magazine. And the result of that, too, I thought, was really to make me think, you know, there's amazing things going on with these people, and I'm only seeing them because they're being showcased in a different way than I'm used to. So I've become much more skeptical over time of the line between those two things. When I published Immobility with Tor, Tor is generally a science fiction press. They do a range of things, but science fiction is what they're most known for. That book was accepted at the same time by Coffee House Press, and I realized that if I published it with Coffee House, everyone would see it as innovative fiction and think of it as very literature. If I published it with Tor, then there'd be a component of my audience that would see it as science fiction, and I was really curious to see what would happen. So I suppose I was kind of experimenting with my career, and it was really instructive to me just to see, you know, how just the way in which something was presented ends up having an effect on how people look at it.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess I would say, what is a writer would be the better question for me. I mean, I think who is a curious way to do it. I mean, I think that for me, it's so tied to just the act of writing itself, and I know so many students, especially, who are more concerned about being a writer than writing, and for me, the more productive thing is writing. So that's it. It's I would say that being a writer is really based on the act of writing, and that being something that's integral to your sense of who you are, rather than, you know, what publishing books or how you appear publicly or that sort of thing. But there's something, I think, essential to a writer about the act of writing, and it gives you something that you probably can't get in any other way.